Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a complete journey through the greatest love story in royal history, the tale of King Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, whose forbidden romance shook the British Empire and changed the monarchy forever. We'll softly explore the entire epic, from Edward's lonely childhood in royal palaces to his rebellious youth as the world's most eligible bachelor, from Wallis's Baltimore beginnings to her rise in London society, through the constitutional crisis that gripped an empire, to their romantic exile and eternal love that lasted until death. This is the story of a king who chose his heart over his crown, of an American woman who inspired the greatest sacrifice in royal history, and of a love so powerful it toppled traditions that had stood for centuries. We'll witness their first meeting at a country house party, follow their growing passion through the glamorous 1930s, experience the dramatic abdication crisis of 1936, and accompany them through 36 years of exile where love proved stronger than any kingdom, before you drift away into the deepest, most peaceful sleep. Please take a moment to like this video, leave a gentle comment about your favorite royal love stories, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. This complete journey will carry you through the night with the most romantic and dramatic story in modern royal history. So settle into your most comfortable position, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers of love conquering duty lull you into the most restful sleep. We'll begin in the nurseries of Victorian England and end in the gardens of Windsor, where two hearts that changed the world now rest together for eternity. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family tonight. You're about to experience the ultimate royal bedtime story, told with all the softness and care that will carry you gently into dreams filled with castle ballrooms, forbidden romance, and love triumphant. So cozy up, dear dreamer, and prepare for a journey through love's greatest victory over duty, told in the soothing tones that will guide you peacefully through the night. Let the story of Edward and Wallis, the king who quit for love, be your gentle companion into the sweetest dreams. Sweet dreams await, dear listener. Let our tale begin. Edward, later known as King Edward VIII and the Duke of Windsor, entered this world on a warm summer evening, June 23, 1894, at White Lodge in Richmond Park, Surrey. The peaceful Georgian mansion, surrounded by ancient oak trees and rolling meadows, would witness the birth of a prince whose very existence would one day shake the foundations of the British Empire. As twilight settled over the park that June evening, Queen Victoria's great-grandson drew his first breath in rooms adorned with soft silk wallpaper and gentle candlelight. The lodge, with its elegant white facade and tall windows overlooking deer-filled parkland, seemed the perfect nursery for a future king. Little did anyone know that this child, born Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, would grow to value love above all the crowns and ceremonies that awaited him. His father, George, was then the Duke of York, a naval officer with kind eyes but stern principles who would one day become King George V. His mother, the gracious Mary of Teck, possessed a quiet dignity that would serve the monarchy well through decades of change. Together, they would raise 6 children in the grand tradition of royal duty. Though their eldest son would chart a very different course, the baby prince was always known within the family circle by his last given name, David. This simple, biblical name carried none of the weight of his grander titles, and perhaps it was this gentle nickname that first hinted at the man he would become, someone who preferred the warmth of human connection to the cold marble of royal palaces. As young David grew from infant to boy, his world expanded beyond the peaceful walls of White Lodge to encompass the vast network of royal residences that dotted the English countryside. York Cottage at Sandringham became his primary home, a modest dwelling by royal standards, with cozy rooms and comfortable furnishings that created an atmosphere more reminiscent of a country vicarage than a prince's palace. The cottage, nestled among the Norfolk pines with their gentle whisper in the coastal wind, provided a surprisingly intimate setting for royal childhood. Here, David would spend long summer afternoons in the garden, where his nanny would read to him beneath the shade of ancient elm trees, their leaves rustling softly in the sea breeze that carried the scent of wild roses and lavender. But royal childhood, even in such peaceful surroundings, came with its own particular challenges. David's father, though loving in his way, believed firmly in discipline and duty. The Duke of York had been shaped by his own naval training, where order and obedience were not mere suggestions, but the foundation of survival itself. These principles, so necessary aboard storm-tossed ships, seemed perhaps less suited to the quiet nurseries where his children played. Young David, with his bright eyes and quick mind, often found himself at odds with the rigid schedules and formal protocols that governed royal life, while other children might run freely through fields and gardens. The prince's movements were carefully choreographed, his lessons precisely timed, his very play supervised by attentive servants who understood that this child carried the weight of future kingship in his small shoulders. The relationship between father and son, though founded on genuine affection, was marked by a distance that seemed impossible to bridge. The Duke spoke to his eldest son with the same formal courtesy he might use with a junior officer, while David longed for the easy warmth he observed between other fathers and sons during their carefully supervised encounters with the outside world. As David approached his teenage years, the gentle rhythms of family life gave way to the more structured demands of royal education. His lessons, conducted in the quiet morning rooms of various palaces, covered everything from constitutional history to modern languages, from mathematics to the intricate protocols of court procedure. His tutors, learned men selected for their discretion as much as their knowledge, would arrive each morning like quiet scholars entering a library. The soft scratch of pen on paper, the gentle turning of atlas pages, and the murmured recitation of French verbs created a peaceful soundtrack to the prince's academic days. French lessons were conducted in a sunny drawing room overlooking the gardens at Windsor, where Madame Bricker, his patient instructor, would guide him through the elegant complexities of diplomatic language. Her soft voice, tinged with a gentle Parisian accent, would weave through conditional tenses and subjunctive moods like a lullaby. Though David's attention often wandered to the gardeners working among the rose beds beyond the tall windows, German proved somewhat easier for the prince, perhaps because it connected him to his extensive royal relatives across Europe. The guttural sounds that might seem harsh to other ears fell naturally from his lips, a reminder of the complex web of family relationships that bound European royalty together, like an intricate tapestry woven across national boundaries. But it was his preparation for naval college that would truly shape the young prince's character. In 1907, at the age of 13, David was enrolled at the Royal Naval College, Osborne, on the Isle of Wight. The decision to send him there reflected his grandfather, King Edward VII's, belief that future monarchs needed to understand the sea that both protected and connected the British Empire. The ferry crossing from Portsmouth to the Isle of Wight on that crisp September morning in 1907 marked young David's first real separation from the protective cocoon of palace life. As the white cliffs of the mainland faded into morning mist, the 13-year-old prince faced his future with a mixture of excitement and trepidation that any boy leaving home for the first time would recognize. Osborne House, converted from Queen Victoria's beloved seaside retreat into a naval college, presented an imposing sight as the ferry approached the island. The Italian-style villa, with its twin campanile towers rising against the solent sky, had once echoed with the laughter of the late Queen's children and grandchildren. Now it hummed with the purposeful energy of young cadets learning the ancient art of camanship. The dormitories at Osborne were Spartan affairs, narrow, iron beds, arranged in precise rows, each with a small wooden chest for personal belongings and a washstand that caught the early morning light streaming through tall windows. David's bed was no different from any other cadet's, a deliberate decision designed to teach future naval officers that leadership must be earned through merit rather than inherited through birth. The gentle discipline of naval routine soon became second nature to the prince. The soft brass notes of reveille at dawn, followed by the quiet shuffle of feet on polished floors as cadets dressed in the grey morning light. The rhythmic splash of water in wash basins, the subdued murmur of morning prayers, and the orderly procession to breakfast created a peaceful structure that David found oddly comforting after the unpredictable demands of court life. His classmates, drawn from naval families across Britain, treated him with the careful respect due to royalty, but also with the easy camaraderie that develops among boys sharing the same challenges. During seamanship classes conducted on the college's training ships moored in the Solent, David learned to read the wind's direction from the flutter of pennants, and to find his way by stars that had guided sailors for centuries. The salt air that filled his lungs during these practical lessons carried with it something that palace life had never provided, a sense of belonging to something larger than himself, yet more immediate than the distant concept of empire. Here, among the creaking rigging and gently lapping waves, the future king discovered the simple satisfaction of work well done and skills honestly earned. As David progressed through his naval education, moving from Osborne to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, the world beyond Britain's shores grew increasingly troubled. The summer of 1914, which had begun with such promise of peace and prosperity, dissolved into the chaos of what would become known as the Great War. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in far-off Sarajevo might have seemed like distant thunder to most British citizens, but for the royal family, with its intricate connections to European royalty, the event struck with personal force. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was King George V's first cousin. The network of family relationships that had once seemed to guarantee European stability now promised only heartbreak as cousin prepared to fight cousin when Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914. 20-year-old David faced a dilemma that would define his generation. His naval training had prepared him for service at sea, but his position as heir to the throne created complications that ordinary young men did not face. The very qualities that made him valuable as a future king, his symbolic importance, his ability to inspire loyalty, also made him too precious to risk in actual combat. The prince chafed against these restrictions with all the impatience of youth confronting adult caution. Like thousands of his contemporaries, he burned to prove himself in the great test of his generation. The comfortable rhythms of peacetime training seemed suddenly frivolous when measured against the urgency of national survival. His commission in the Grenadier Guards in August 1914 represented a compromise between royal duty and personal desire. The scarlet and gold uniform that had once been worn primarily for ceremonial occasions now carried the weight of genuine military purpose, even if that purpose would be carefully circumscribed by considerations of royal safety. The Western Front in 1915 presented a landscape that seemed to belong to some terrible dream rather than the green and pleasant countryside David remembered from peacetime travels to France. The rolling chalk downs of Picardy, once dotted with peaceful villages and golden wheat fields, had been transformed into a moonscape of shell holes and tangled wire, where young men from across Europe learned new definitions of courage and sacrifice. David's arrival in France as a staff officer with the Grenadier Guards placed him at the heart of this great tragedy, though always at a carefully maintained distance from its most immediate dangers. His quarters, in a requisition chateau behind the lines, retained something of their former elegance, despite the sandbags that now protected the windows and the military maps that covered one's gracious drawing room walls. The chateau's garden, where French aristocrats had once taken their evening strolls among carefully manicured hedges and ornamental lakes, now served as a dispatch center where motorcyclists arrived at all hours with messages from the trenches. The gentle splash of fountains that had once provided soothing background music for romantic conversations now seemed to mock the grim efficiency of modern warfare. Yet, even in this transformed landscape, moments of unexpected beauty could still surprise the young prince. Dawn, breaking over the battlefield, often painted the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded him of peaceful mornings at Sandringham. The sound of larks singing above the trenches created an almost unbearable contrast between nature's persistent hope and humanity's apparent determination to destroy itself. David's official duties involved liaison work between British and French commands, a role that required diplomatic skills as much as military knowledge. His fluent French, acquired during those peaceful language lessons in Windsor's sunny drawing rooms, now served to bridge the gap between allies, whose cooperation was essential but whose methods often differed dramatically. During visits to forward positions, the prince witnessed scenes that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Soldiers scarcely older than himself, their faces already aged by exposure to horrors that no human should endure, maintaining their positions with a quiet dignity that spoke more eloquently than any speech about the true meaning of duty. The Great War transformed David from a somewhat sheltered royal youth into a public figure who understood, perhaps for the first time, the weight of expectation that rested on his shoulders. His visits to hospitals and supply depots, his meetings with soldiers from across the empire, and his careful participation in the war effort created a bond between the prince and his future, subjects that no amount of formal training could have. Achieved in the makeshift hospitals established in converted schools and manor houses behind the lines, David learned to speak with men who had given everything for their country. The soft rustle of bandages being changed, the gentle murmur of nurses moving between beds, and the quiet conversations that passed for entertainment in these places of healing all contributed to the prince's growing understanding of leadership's true responsibilities. The wounded soldiers he met came from every corner of the British Isles and the empire beyond. Scottish Highlanders, with the distinctive burr of the Hebrides, still strong in their voices despite months in English hospitals. Welsh miners, whose hands, scarred by years of underground labour, now bore the additional marks of modern warfare. Canadian farmers who spoke of wheat fields that seemed impossibly distant from the muddy chaos of Flanders. Each conversation, conducted in the soft tones appropriate to hospitals, and conducted with the careful courtesy that marked David's upbringing, added another thread to the complex tapestry of his understanding. These men had not asked to be born subjects of the British crown, yet they had accepted its obligations with a grace that both humbled and inspired their future king. The letters he wrote home during this period, carefully censored but still revealing, in their emotional honesty, spoke of his growing appreciation for the ordinary courage that seemed to be the war's most abundant resource. "The men are simply magnificent," he wrote to his mother in the careful script he had learned from governesses and tutors. "Their cheerfulness in the face of such difficulties is something I hope I shall never forget." The armistice of November 11, 1918, brought an end to the Great War, but not to its influence on those who had lived through it. David, returning to civilian life as a 24-year-old veteran, carried with him experiences that had fundamentally altered his understanding of both duty and human nature. The London to which he returned seemed both familiar and strange. The same Georgian squares and Victorian monuments stood where they had always stood, but they now served a population that had been forever changed by 4 years of unprecedented suffering and sacrifice. The easy certainties of Edwardian society had been buried somewhere in the mud of the Somme, replaced by a more complex understanding of life's possibilities and limitations. David's own transformation was perhaps most evident in his approach to public duties, where once he had performed ceremonial functions with the dutiful compliance expected of royal children. He now brought to these occasions a personal understanding of what such ceremonies meant to the people they were designed to honor. Veterans, organizations, war memorial dedications, and hospital visits became opportunities for the prince to demonstrate a kind of empathy that surprised both the public and the palace staff. His conversations with former soldiers were marked by a natural ease that suggested genuine understanding rather than polite obligation. The social season of 1919, returning to something like its peacetime pattern after 4 years of wartime austerity, found David a changed participant. The round of balls, house parties, and sporting events that had once seemed the natural order of things now struck him as somehow insufficient response to the magnitude of what the nation had endured. This restlessness, which would characterize much of his adult life, first manifested itself in his approach to royal protocol. Where previous generations of princes had accepted ceremonial requirements as immutable laws of nature, David began to question the necessity of certain traditions and to experiment with more informal approaches to public engagement. The decade that followed the Great War saw David emerge as perhaps the most modern member of the royal family that Britain had ever known. His approach to public duties, his choice of friends, and his personal style all reflected the broader social changes that were transforming British society in the aftermath of the war. The prince's London residence became a gathering place for a new generation of aristocrats and commoners who shared a determination to embrace life's pleasures after witnessing its potential for destruction. Jazz music, flowing from gramophones, in drawing rooms that had once echoed only to chamber music and polite conversation, provided the soundtrack for a generation determined to dance away the memories of recent horrors. David's own appearance reflected this new informality, where his father favored the formal dress and rigid posture of Victorian royalty. The prince adopted the easier style of the modern gentleman. His clothes, while still impeccably tailored, were cut in the softer lines that characterized post-war fashion. His manner, while never forgetting the dignity appropriate to his position, carried a warmth that made both aristocrats and commoners feel welcomed into his presence. The nightclubs and country house parties where David spent his leisure hours provided more than simple entertainment. They offered opportunities for the future king to understand his generation's hopes and fears in ways that formal court presentations never could. The conversations that continued until dawn, lubricated by champagne and animated by the nervous energy of survivors, revealed truths about British society that no government report could have captured. His romantic entanglements during this period, while carefully managed by palace staff, reflected the same modern attitudes that characterized his approach to other aspects of life. The Prince of Wales was no longer expected to remain celibate until marriage, but his relationships were expected to remain discreet and to avoid any hint of scandal that might reflect poorly on the monarchy. In 1918, at a reception following his return from France, David met Frida Dudley Ward, the wife of a liberal member of parliament. Their encounter, at first casual and social, gradually developed into something much more serious that would define the prince's emotional life for the next 16 years. Mrs. Dudley Ward, with her quick wit and genuine warmth, represented something that David had rarely encountered in his carefully orchestrated royal existence. A relationship based on mutual affection rather than calculated advantage. Their friendship, which gradually deepened into love, provided the prince with his first taste of the kind of emotional fulfillment that would ultimately prove more important to him than any crown. The affair, conducted with the discretion required by both their positions, unfolded against the backdrop of country house weekends and London society gatherings. Secret telephone calls, coded letters, and carefully arranged meetings created a parallel existence that ran alongside David's official duties like a hidden stream beneath the formal garden of royal protocol. Mrs. Dudley Ward's influence on the prince extended far beyond their private relationship. Her natural empathy and social awareness helped shape David's understanding of the changing world beyond palace walls. Through her, he encountered writers, artists, and political thinkers who would never have been welcomed in traditional court circles, but whose perspectives enriched his understanding of the nation. He would one day rule the challenges of maintaining such a relationship while fulfilling the endless obligations of royal duty, created a tension that would characterize much of David's adult life, the very qualities that made him attractive as a modern prince's informality. His emotional openness, his rejection of outdated protocols, also made him vulnerable to criticism from those who preferred their royalty more distant and mysterious. British press, operating under the informal censorship that protected royal privacy, reported extensively on the Prince of Wales's public activities, while maintaining complete silence about his personal relationships. This created a curious split between David's public image as the empire's most eligible bachelor and the private reality of his deep, emotional commitment to a woman he could never marry. As the 1920s progressed, David's role within the monarchy expanded to include extensive tours of the British Empire. These journeys, designed to strengthen the bonds between Britain and her distant dominions, provided the prince with education in both the possibilities and the limitations of imperial rule. His 1920 tour of Australia and New Zealand revealed a prince transformed by his wartime experiences into a remarkably effective representative of the crown. The informal manner that had sometimes troubled palace officials proved perfectly suited to the more relaxed social atmosphere of the dominions, where excessive formality was often viewed with suspicion. In Sydney Harbour, as the HMS Renown carried, the prince passed headlands dotted with welcoming crowds. David experienced, perhaps for the first time, the genuine affection that the empire's citizens felt for the royal family. The cheers that echoed across the water carried a warmth that no amount of ceremonial protocol could have manufactured. The dusty mining towns of Western Australia, the sheep stations of New Zealand's South Island, and the growing cities of Canada all provided opportunities for the prince to demonstrate his growing skill at connecting with ordinary people. His ability to engage in genuine conversation with farmers, factory workers, and frontier settlers revealed a talent for monarchy that owed nothing to inherited privilege and everything to personal charisma. These tours also revealed the complexity of imperial relationships that would challenge the monarchy throughout David's lifetime. The Great War had created new expectations among Dominion populations who had sacrificed so much for the imperial cause. They demanded not just ceremonial recognition, but genuine partnership in determining their own futures. David's reports to his father about these tours often emphasized the changing nature of imperial loyalty. Where once the Dominions had been content to accept British leadership without question, They now insisted on being consulted as equals in all matters affecting their interests. This evolution from empire to commonwealth would require new approaches to royal leadership that David seemed uniquely equipped to provide. King George V watched his eldest son's development with a mixture of pride and concern that reflected his own understanding of the monarchy's precarious position in the post-war world. The king, shaped by Victorian concepts of duty and dignity, appreciated David's obvious popularity but worried about the prince's apparent impatience with traditional protocols. Their relationship, always somewhat formal, became increasingly strained as David's modern attitudes came into conflict with his father's more conservative instincts. The king's concern was not simply personal but institutional. He understood that the monarchy's survival depended on maintaining a careful balance between accessibility and mystique. Private conversations between father and son, conducted in the quiet comfort of the king's study at Buckingham Palace, often revealed the depth of their philosophical differences. Where George V saw in royal protocol the accumulated wisdom of centuries, David saw obstacles to genuine connection with the people he would someday rule. The king's health, never robust since his wartime injury, provided additional urgency to these discussions. His serious illness in 1928 forced both men to confront the reality that David's accession might come sooner than expected. The prospect of inheriting the throne while still in his 30s, with so many personal questions unresolved, weighed heavily on the prince's mind. George V's famous prediction that David would ruin himself within 12 months of becoming king reflected not mere paternal pessimism, but genuine concern about his son's ability to subordinate personal desires to royal duty. The king had spent his entire adult life learning to suppress his own preferences in service to the crown, and he feared that David lacked either the will or the ability to make similar sacrifices. As the 1920s drew to a close, David had evolved from a somewhat sheltered royal youth into one of the most recognizable and popular figures in the British Empire. His wartime service had given him credibility with veterans and their families. His informal manner had endeared him to younger generations seeking alternatives to their parents' more rigid social structures, yet beneath this public success lay personal tensions that threatened to complicate his future reign. His relationship with Frieda Dudley Ward had taught him to value emotional fulfillment in ways that might prove incompatible with royal duty. His impatience with protocol had created efficiency in some areas, but concern in others about his willingness to accept constitutional limitations. The great houses of England, where David spent his weekends and holidays, buzzed with speculation about the prince's eventual marriage. The social obligations that had once seemed natural and inevitable now appeared to David as potential barriers to the kind of authentic relationship he had discovered was possible between a man and a woman who genuinely cared for each other. His interests extended beyond Britain's shores to include a fascination with modern developments in architecture, aviation, and social organization. He was particularly intrigued by reports of progress in countries that had abandoned traditional monarchies in favor of more innovative forms of government. This intellectual curiosity, while admirable in many ways, sometimes led him to question assumptions that his father and grandfather had never thought to examine. The stock market crash of 1929 and the economic depression that followed created new challenges for the monarchy as an institution. The contrast between royal privilege and widespread suffering required careful management to avoid the kind of revolutionary sentiment that had already swept away several European monarchies. David's response to these challenges would ultimately define his reign and his legacy. His instinctive empathy for suffering and his genuine desire to modernize the monarchy carried the potential for both unprecedented success and catastrophic failure. The choices he would make in the coming decade would not only determine his own fate, but reshape the British monarchy for generations to come. In the winter of 1931, as London society gathered for its annual round of parties and receptions, a meeting took place that would ultimately change the course of British history. Lady Furness, an American who had married into the British aristocracy, decided to introduce her friend Wallis Simpson to the Prince of Wales during a weekend party at her country estate. The setting could hardly have been more innocuous. Borough Court, near Melton Mowbray in Leicestershire, was the kind of modest country house where the British upper classes had been conducting their intricate social rituals for centuries. The rooms, warmed by log fires and softly lit by table lamps, provided the perfect atmosphere for the kind of casual conversation that often determined the fate of nations. Wallis Simpson recently arrived from America with her second husband. Ernest represented a type that was becoming increasingly common in London society, the intelligent, well-dressed American woman whose fresh perspective and lack of deference to British social hierarchies often proved more appealing to British men than the carefully trained daughters of their own aristocracy. The conversation between the Prince and Mrs. Simpson on that January evening revealed personalities that complemented each other in unexpected ways. Where David had been taught from childhood to please and charm, Wallis had learned, through harder experience, to speak her mind and defend her own interests. Where he sought approval and affection, she offered honesty and challenge. Their initial exchange, conducted over cocktails in Lady Furness's drawing room, while other guests chatted quietly nearby, suggested none of the drama that would eventually unfold. David, accustomed to deference from both men and women, found himself engaged in conversation with someone who treated him as an equal rather than as a royal personage. Requiring special consideration, Mrs. Simpson, for her part, seemed genuinely unimpressed by the prince's position and far more interested in his opinions and personality. This attitude, so different from the careful flattery that usually surrounded David, proved remarkably refreshing to a man who had spent his entire life wondering whether people liked him for himself or for his title. As the evening progressed, at Borough Court, with conversation flowing as smoothly as the wine and the fire casting dancing shadows on panelled walls, none of the guests could have imagined they were witnessing the first act of a drama that would captivate the world. The Prince and Mrs. Simpson continued their conversation through dinner, and into the hours when other guests began to excuse themselves for the night. Their discussion ranged across topics from American politics to European literature, from the challenges of imperial governance to the simple pleasures of country life. By the time they parted that evening, with the casual courtesy appropriate, two new acquaintances who had enjoyed each other's company both carried away impressions that would prove impossible to forget. David had encountered a woman whose intelligence and independence challenged him in ways he had never experienced. Wallis had met a man whose position in the world was matched by a surprising vulnerability and humanity. The winter moon, setting over the Leicestershire countryside as the last guests retired to their rooms, illuminated a landscape that seemed unchanged by the evening's events. The same fields and hedgerows that had witnessed centuries of English history stretched away into the darkness, their familiar patterns offering no hint of the transformation that would soon sweep away. So much that had seemed permanent and unchangable.in. Her room, with its comfortable chintz, curtains, and gentle warmth from the dying fire. Wallis Simpson perhaps reflected on the unexpected pleasure of meeting someone who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. She could hardly have imagined that this pleasant evening's conversation would eventually place her at the center of the greatest constitutional crisis in modern British history. Meanwhile, the Prince of Wales retired to his own quarters, with his mind full of new impressions and possibilities. The woman he had met that evening possessed qualities he had rarely encountered in his carefully orchestrated social circle, authenticity, intelligence, and a complete absence of the calculated deference that usually characterized his interactions with others as sleep settled over Borough Court, with its sleeping guests unaware of the historical forces they had set in motion. The future remained unwritten. The choices that would determine whether duty or desire would ultimately triumph still lay ahead, waiting to unfold in the gentle rhythm of seasons and social occasions that had always governed the lives of the British upper classes. Tomorrow would bring new obligations and opportunities, new meetings and partings, all conducted according to the ancient protocols that had served the monarchy for centuries. Yet something fundamental had shifted during those quiet hours of conversation by the fireside, something that would eventually challenge every assumption about the relationship between personal happiness and public duty. The stage was now set for a love story that would test the very foundations of the British constitutional system and ultimately prove that even kings must sometimes choose between the crowns they inherit and the hearts they cannot deny. Rest well, dear listener, and join us next time as we explore the remarkable American woman who would capture a king's heart and change the course of history forever. Until then, may your dreams be filled with the gentle rustle of silk gowns, the soft glow of firelight on paneled walls, and the quiet conversations that sometimes determine the fate of nations. Good night and sweet dreams. Bessie Wallis Warfield, later known as the Duchess of Windsor, entered the world on June 19, 1896, in the gentle summer warmth of Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, the small resort town nestled along the Mason-Dixon line where Pennsylvania meets Maryland, provided a peaceful setting for the birth of a child who would one day become the most talked about woman in the British Empire. Her arrival came at Monterey, in charming wooden hotel where wealthy Baltimore families escaped the humid summers of the Chesapeake Bay. The inn, with its wide verandas and comfortable rocking chairs, offered visitors the simple pleasures of mountain air and quiet evenings filled with the gentle sounds of crickets and distant piano music drifting from the main building. Wallis's father, Teakle Wallis Warfield, was a gentle man whose health had been fragile from an early age. The family had hoped that the mountain air might strengthen his constitution, but consumption as tuberculosis was then called had already taken to firm a hold. He died when Wallis was just 5 months old, leaving behind a young widow and an infant daughter who would learn early in life that security could never be taken for granted. Her mother, Alice Montague Warfield, faced the daunting prospect of raising a child alone in an era when few options existed for widowed women. Alice's own family background provided some comfort. The Montagues were well established in Baltimore society, but financial resources remained limited, creating an undercurrent of anxiety that would shape young Wallis's understanding of the world. The family name that Wallis carried into the world reflected the complex social hierarchies of turn-of-the-century America. The Warfields had been prominent in Maryland since colonial times, their fortunes built on shipping and banking during Baltimore's golden age as a major Atlantic port. Yet this distinguished heritage came with obligations as much as advantages, requiring the maintenance of appearances even when resources grew thin. Young Wallis spent her earliest years moving between the homes of various relatives, each offering different levels of comfort and security. The most stable periods were spent with her grandmother, Anna Warfield, in a substantial brownstone house near Baltimore's Mount Vernon district, where the Washington Monument rose like a gentle beacon above tree-lined streets and elegant Georgian facades dot the house on Preston Street, with its high ceilings and tall windows that caught the morning light, provided Wallis with her first taste of true domestic stability. Her grandmother's morning routine became a source of comfort, the soft rustle of silk as Anna dressed for the day, the gentle clink of china as breakfast was served in the sunny dining room, and the quiet efficiency of servants who moved through. The house-like figures in a well-choreographed dance, Saturday shopping expeditions with her grandmother became highlights of Wallis's young life. Hand in hand, they would walk down Howard Street, Baltimore's premier shopping district, where elegant department stores displayed the latest fashions from New York and Paris. The soft murmur of other shoppers, the gentle ring of cash registers, and the rustle of tissue paper being wrapped around carefully chosen purchases created a soundtrack of feminine satisfaction that Wallis would remember throughout her life. But even these pleasant interludes carried undertones of insecurity. Wallis learned early to notice the careful calculations that preceded each purchase, the way her grandmother would examine price tags with discreet attention, and the subtle art of maintaining appearances while managing limited resources. These lessons in elegant economy would serve her well in later years when she navigated the complex social requirements of British society. The family's financial situation improved somewhat when Alice married John Freeman Racine, the son of a prominent Democratic political figure in Baltimore. The Racine house, larger and more modern than anything Wallis had known before, offered glimpses of the kind of life that money could provide: multiple servants, elaborate dinner parties, and the easy confidence that came with genuine financial security. Wallis's formal education began at Miss O'Donnell's School, a small but respected institution where the daughters of Baltimore's better families learned the accomplishments considered essential for young ladies of their class. The school, housed in a converted mansion with spacious rooms and polished floors, provided an atmosphere of genteel learning that emphasized character formation as much as academic achievement. The daily routine at Miss O'Donnell's reflected the careful attention to detail that characterized elite female education of the era. Morning prayers in the school's chapel, with sunlight streaming through stained glass windows onto polished wooden pews. Lessons in literature and history conducted in comfortable classrooms where teachers spoke in soft, cultured voices about the great works of Western civilization. French lessons held special importance in this curriculum, reflecting the assumption that any educated American woman should be able to converse with ease in the language of diplomacy and culture. Wallis proved an apt student, her quick mind grasping not just vocabulary and grammar, but the subtle nuances of expression that distinguished truly fluent speakers from mere students of the language. But it was at Oldfield School, where Wallis completed her education, that she truly flourished. This institution, nestled in the Maryland countryside near Cookiesville, provided the kind of finishing school experience that shaped the daughters of America's social elite. The campus, with its Georgian buildings and carefully maintained gardens, created an atmosphere of refined learning that prepared young women for their expected roles as wives and mothers in high society at Oldfields. Wallis discovered her talent for leadership among her peers. Her natural confidence, combined with a quick wit and genuine charm, made her a favorite among both students and teachers. She excelled at basketball, throwing herself into the game with an athletic enthusiasm that revealed the competitive spirit she would carry throughout her life. Her friendship with Mary Kirk, a girl from a prominent Pennsylvania family, began during these school years and would prove to be one of the most enduring relationships of Wallis's life. The two young women, similar in their ambition and intelligence, but different in temperament, formed a bond that would survive the complexities and betrayals that later complicated both their lives. Graduation from Oldfields in 1914 marked Wallis's formal entry into Baltimore society, though her debut was necessarily modest compared to the elaborate presentations enjoyed by wealthier families. The social season of 1914, conducted against the backdrop of growing international tensions, carried an undercurrent of uncertainty that reflected the broader world's movement toward global conflict. Wallis's coming out party, held in the Racine family home, showcased her stepfather's political connections while revealing the careful economies that still governed the family's social position. The guest list included Baltimore's most prominent families, but the entertainment and refreshments reflected the kind of calculated elegance that maximized impact while minimizing expense. The young men who attended these social gatherings represented the cream of Baltimore's eligible bachelors, sons of banking families, future lawyers and doctors, and scions of old Maryland families whose fortunes had survived the Civil War and Reconstruction. Wallis, with her quick conversation and genuine interest in the world beyond Baltimore, proved popular among these young men. Though she seemed in no hurry to settle on any particular suitor, her social success during this period reflected qualities that would serve her well throughout her life: an ability to make each person she spoke with feel that they were the most interesting person in the room, a genuine curiosity about other people's experiences and opinions, and a talent for creating the kind of animated conversation that made parties memorable long after the last guest had departed. The outbreak of war in Europe in August 1914 cast a shadow over the social season, though America's initial neutrality allowed Baltimore society to continue its round of parties and entertainments. Nevertheless, the war's influence could be felt in the conversations that took place at these gatherings, where young men increasingly talked about their obligations to serve their country, and young women began to consider how their own lives might be changed by global events. In the spring of 1916, Wallis accepted an invitation to visit her cousin, Corinne Mustin, in Pensacola, Florida, where her cousin's husband was stationed at the Naval Aviation Training Facility. The trip, intended as a pleasant interlude from Baltimore's social routine, would instead introduce Wallis to both love and the painful realities of marriage to a military officer. Pensacola in 1916 buzzed with the energy of young men learning to fly the primitive aircraft that would soon carry them into combat over the battlefields of Europe. The Naval Air Station, with its wooden hangars and grass runways, represented the cutting edge of military technology, though the machines themselves were little more than fabric and wire held together by hope and mechanical ingenuity. It was here that Wallis met Lieutenant Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., a pilot whose easy confidence and dashing appearance epitomized everything romantic that young women associated with military aviation. Win Spencer, 8 years older than Wallis, and already an experienced flyer, possessed the kind of masculine self-assurance that appealed to a young woman raised on stories of heroic adventure. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of a military installation preparing for war. Evening walks along Pensacola Bay, with the setting sun painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. Picnics on nearby beaches where the constant sound of waves provided a peaceful counterpoint to the distant hum of aircraft engines from the training field. Win's proposal, delivered during a moonlit walk along the shore, seemed to Wallis like something from the romantic novels she had read during her school years. Here was a chance to escape the careful calculations and social restrictions of Baltimore life for a marriage that promised adventure and independence in exotic locations across the globe. Their wedding, held at Christ's Episcopal Church in Baltimore on November 8, 1916, brought together Win's naval colleagues and Wallis's society friends in a ceremony that seemed to promise happiness and prosperity. The bride, radiant in white satin and family lace, appeared to have secured exactly the kind of future that ambitious young women of her generation sought: marriage to a successful officer with excellent prospects for advancement. The honeymoon period of Wallis's first marriage lasted approximately as long as their actual honeymoon trip to White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, Once the excitement of the wedding festivities faded, the realities of life as a military wife began to intrude on the romantic dreams that had sustained her through their engagement. When Spencer's drinking, which had seemed like harmless social enjoyment during their courtship, revealed itself as a serious problem that affected every aspect of their relationship. Military life, with its combination of intense pressure and extended periods of boredom, created conditions that often drove men to seek relief in alcohol. But Wynn's consumption went far beyond what was considered normal, even in a profession. Their first home together, base housing at the Naval Air Station, provided Wallis with her initial education in the realities of military life. The small apartment, with its government-issued furniture and thin walls, offered little privacy and less comfort than anything she had known during her Baltimore youth. The constant noise of aircraft operations, punctuated by the occasional crash that reminded everyone of aviation's inherent dangers, created an atmosphere of tension that made normal domestic life nearly impossible. Wallis's attempts to create a comfortable home within these limitations revealed both her resourcefulness and her growing understanding of how much her previous life had depended on resources she had taken for granted. Simple pleasures like entertaining friends for dinner became complex logistical challenges when undertaken with military housing, limited income, and a husband whose unpredictable behavior made social planning nearly impossible. The isolation that military wives experienced, cut off from their families and childhood friends, intensified these difficulties. While Wynne spent his days with fellow officers who understood the pressures of their profession, Wallis found herself largely alone, responsible for managing a household under conditions that grew more challenging as Wynne's drinking worsened and his behavior became increasingly erratic. Her letters home during this period, carefully worded to avoid alarming her family, nevertheless conveyed growing disillusionment with military life and marriage. The adventure she had expected had been replaced by a daily struggle to maintain dignity and hope in circumstances that seemed designed to crush both. By 1920, Wallis's marriage had deteriorated to the point where even the appearance of normal domestic life became impossible to maintain. Wynne's drinking had progressed to the stage where his behavior threatened not only their relationship but his military career, creating a crisis that forced Wallis to confront the possibility that her marriage might not be salvageable. Their decision to separate, while painful, came as something of a relief to Wallis, who had spent 4 years trying to create stability in an increasingly unstable situation. The separation agreement, worked out with the discretion required to protect Wynne's military standing, allowed Wallis to return to her family while maintaining the fiction that the separation was temporary. Her return to Baltimore after 4 years as a military wife revealed how much both she and her hometown had changed during her absence. The city, prosperous from wartime contracts and the economic boom that followed the armistice, buzzed with new energy and opportunity. Young women who had worked in factories during the war now expected greater independence and recognition than previous generations had enjoyed. Wallis herself had been transformed by her experiences as a military wife. The protected young woman who had left Baltimore as a bride had been replaced by someone who understood the realities of financial insecurity, domestic violence, and social isolation. These painful lessons had taught her to rely on her own resources and judgment in ways that would prove invaluable in the challenges that lay ahead. Her social re-entry into Baltimore life required careful navigation of the gossip and speculation that inevitably surrounded a woman living apart from her husband. Wallis managed this challenge with characteristic determination, neither hiding from society nor offering explanations that might provide ammunition for her critics. The small apartment she rented in Georgetown, furnished with cast-offs from family members and decorated with her own modest savings, became a symbol of her new independence. Here, For the first time in her adult life, Wallis could make decisions based on her own preferences rather than the requirements of military protocol or family expectations. In 1924, Wallis made the decision that would prove crucial to her eventual meeting with the Prince of Wales. She accepted Wynn's invitation to join him in the Far East, where he had been posted as commander of a gunboat on the Yangtze River. The decision reflected both hope that a change of scenery might repair their marriage and practical recognition that her limited finances made independent living increasingly difficult. The journey to China aboard a troop transport provided Wallis with her first extended experience of international travel. The weeks at sea, with their enforced leisure and constantly changing horizons, offered time for reflection and planning that had been impossible during the immediate crisis of separation and divorce proceedings. Her arrival in Hong Kong revealed a world of expatriate society that operated according to its own unique rules and hierarchies. The British colonial community, with its elaborate social protocols and rigid class distinctions, provided both opportunities and challenges for an American woman whose marital status remained ambiguous. The reunion with Wynn, initially promising, quickly revealed that distance and time had done nothing to resolve the fundamental problems that had destroyed their marriage. If anything, the isolation and drinking culture of expatriate life had worsened Wynn's problems while doing nothing to address the underlying incompatibilities that had made their relationship untenable. Wallis's decision to leave Wynn permanently and travel independently through China reflected a courage that surprised even her closest friends. Solo travel by Western women in 1920s China required not only personal bravery but considerable resourcefulness, particularly for someone with limited financial resources and no established connections in the region. Her Lotus Year in China, as she would later describe it, provided experiences that broadened her perspective and reinforced her confidence in her own ability to navigate unfamiliar social situations. From the international settlement in Shanghai to the ancient splendors of Peking, Wallis encountered a world that challenged every assumption she had formed about how societies could be organized and how individuals might find their place within them. Wallis's return to America in 1925 marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one that would be characterized by greater independence and clearer understanding of her own capabilities and limitations. The divorce from Wynn Spencer, finalized in December 1927, provided legal closure to a relationship that had been emotionally over for years. Her decision to settle in New York rather than return to Baltimore reflected both practical considerations and personal growth. The city, with its more relaxed social attitudes and greater opportunities for independent women, offered possibilities that would have been unthinkable in the more conservative atmosphere of her hometown. The small apartment she shared with her friend Mary Kirk became a base for exploring New York's social possibilities. The parties and gatherings they attended introduced Wallis to a world of writers, artists, and intellectuals who valued conversation and wit more than inherited social position. It was during this period that Wallis met Ernest Simpson, an American businessman who had adopted British mannerisms and attitudes during his wartime service with the Coldstream Guards. Ernest, recently divorced and establishing himself in the shipping business, represented exactly the kind of stability and respectability that Wallis needed after the chaos of her first marriage. Their courtship, conducted against the backdrop of New York's cultural renaissance, combined genuine affection with practical considerations that both parties understood and accepted. Ernest offered financial security and social respectability. Wallis brought charm, intelligence, and the kind of sophisticated companionship that successful businessmen valued in an era when wives were expected to be social partners as well as domestic managers. Their wedding in July 1928, a quiet civil ceremony followed by a honeymoon in Europe marked Wallis's transition from independent divorcee to respectable married woman. The ceremony, conducted at a London registry office, reflected their mutual desire to begin their new life together without the elaborate fanfare that had characterized her first wedding. Wallis's arrival in London as Mrs. Ernest Simpson in 1928 coincided with a period of unprecedented social change in British society. The Great War had shattered many traditional assumptions about class and privilege, creating opportunities for newcomers to establish themselves in circles that might previously have remained closed to outsiders. The Simpsons' flat in Brian's Court, while modest by the standards of established London society, provided an elegant base for entertaining the growing circle of friends and acquaintances that Wallis gathered around herself. Her dinner parties, carefully planned to showcase both her domestic skills and her talent for bringing together interesting combinations of guests, quickly became noted for their combination of excellent food, stimulating conversation, and relaxed atmosphere. Ernest's business connections provided entree to certain levels of London society, but it was Wallis's own charm and intelligence that secured their social position. Her American background, rather than proving a liability, added an element of novelty and freshness that many British hosts found appealing in an era when traditional social forms were being questioned and revised. The challenge of establishing herself in British society taught Wallis valuable lessons about the subtle art of social navigation, the complex hierarchies and unspoken rules that governed London's upper classes required careful study and intuitive understanding that went far beyond simple wealth or family background. Her success in mastering these subtleties reflected both natural talent and determined effort. Wallis made it her business to understand not just what was expected of her, but why certain behaviors and attitudes carried the significance they did. Within British social structures, the friendships she formed during this period, particularly with other American women who had married into British society, provided both support and information that proved invaluable in navigating the complex world of London entertaining and social positioning. Wallis's first meeting with the Prince of Wales at Lady Furness's country house party in January 1931 represented the culmination of her careful cultivation of London society connections. Her presence at such an exclusive gathering reflected not just her social success, but her friend Thelma Furness's confidence that Wallis would prove an entertaining and appropriate addition to the Prince's social circle. The weekend itself unfolded according to the carefully choreographed patterns that governed such gatherings. Arrival by motorcar on Friday afternoon, with luggage efficiently distributed to guest rooms by experienced servants. Cocktails before dinner in drawing rooms warmed by log fires and softly lit by table lamps that created intimate conversational groupings. Wallis's initial conversation with the Prince of Wales revealed the quick wit and direct manner that had served her well in New York and London society. Where other guests might have been overawed by royal presence, she treated the prince as she would any other interesting dinner companion, engaging him in the kind of spirited exchange that had made her parties popular among London's more sophisticated social sets. The prince, accustomed to the deference and careful flattery that usually characterized his social interactions, found Wallis's approach refreshingly honest and stimulating. Her questions about his experiences and opinions suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness, while her own observations about American and British society revealed a perspective that he found both informative and entertaining. Their conversation continued through dinner and into the evening hours, when other guests began to retire. The topics ranged from serious discussions of political and social issues to lighter exchanges about travel, literature, and the changing nature of modern life. By the time they parted that evening, both carried away impressions that would prove impossible to forget. In the months following their first meeting, Wallis found herself increasingly included in the social gatherings that surrounded the Prince of Wales. These invitations, extended through Lady Furness and other mutual friends, provided opportunities for the friendship that had begun at Borough Court to develop and deepen. The settings for these encounters varied from intimate dinner parties in London flats to elaborate weekend gatherings at country estates. But the pattern of conversation between Wallis and the Prince remained consistent. Their exchanges combined serious discussion of contemporary issues with the kind of personal revelation that marked the development of genuine friendship. Wallis's position as a married woman provided a safe framework for these developing relationships. Her presence at royal gatherings could be explained by her friendship with Lady Furness and her role as social companion to the prince's current mistress. This arrangement allowed their friendship to develop without the kind of speculation that might have surrounded a single woman in similar circumstances. Ernest Simpson's business obligations, which frequently took him away from London for extended periods, provided additional opportunities for Wallis to participate in the prince's social circle without the complications that might have arisen from her husband's constant presence. Ernest, when he was available, proved a popular addition to these gatherings, his knowledge of literature and art complementing Wallis's more general social skills. The prince's growing dependence on these friendships reflected both the limitations of traditional court society and his own need for the kind of honest companionship that royal protocol usually made impossible. In Wallis, he found someone who could provide intellectual stimulation, emotional support, and genuine affection without the calculated deference that characterized most of his relationships. By 1934, the friendship between Wallis and the Prince of Wales had evolved into something deeper and more complex than either had originally anticipated. The departure of Lady Furness for an extended visit to America created a situation where Wallis found herself serving as the Prince's primary social companion, a role that inevitably drew them closer together. The intimacy that developed during this period reflected both emotional compatibility and practical circumstance. The Prince, approaching his 40th birthday without having formed a lasting romantic attachment, found in Wallis the kind of emotional fulfillment that had been missing from his carefully orchestrated royal existence. Wallis, for her part, discovered that her marriage to Ernest, while providing security and respectability, had not satisfied her need for intellectual and emotional stimulation. The prince's obvious devotion and the opportunities that his friendship provided for travel, adventure, and social prominence appealed to aspects of her personality that her quiet, domestic life had left unfulfilled. Their relationship during this period combined the excitement of forbidden romance with the practical complications of their respective positions. The prince's royal status made discretion essential, while Wallis's marriage required careful management to avoid scandal that might damage both her reputation and Ernest's business interests. The emotional intensity that characterized their relationship during 1934 and 1935 reflected the prince's passionate nature and Wallis's own capacity for deep feeling. Their correspondence, conducted in code and delivered through trusted intermediaries, revealed the development of genuine love between two people whose circumstances made normal courtship impossible. The prince's determination to marry Wallis, which became clear during this period, represented a fundamental challenge to the assumptions that had governed his life since childhood. For the first time, he faced a choice between personal happiness and royal duty, a choice that would ultimately determine not only his own fate, but the future of the British monarchy itself. As the relationship between Wallis and the Prince of Wales deepened during 1935, the pressures surrounding their romance began to intensify from multiple directions. The prince's family, particularly his father, King George V, viewed the relationship with growing alarm as reports of Wallis's influence over their heir reached them through various channels. The king's concerns reflected both personal disapproval of his son's choice and institutional worry about the monarchy's reputation. Divorced women, regardless of their personal qualities, were considered unsuitable companions for future kings. According to the moral and religious standards that still governed British society in the mid-1930s, political figures, including Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, began to receive reports about the prince's relationship through intelligence channels and society gossip. These reports, while discreet, painted a picture of a future king whose judgment might be compromised by his emotional involvement with an inappropriate woman. The British press, operating under informal agreements that protected royal privacy, maintained public silence about the relationship while private speculation grew increasingly intense. Society figures, diplomatic representatives, and government officials all contributed to a growing sense that the SI situation required careful monitoring and possible intervention. Wallis herself began to feel the weight of this scrutiny as her every appearance and activity became subject to observation and comment. The freedom she had enjoyed as simply another member of London society was gradually replaced by the kind of intense attention that made normal life increasingly difficult. Ernest Simpson, caught between his wife's obvious infatuation with the prince and his own need to maintain his business relationships and social position, found himself in an impossible situation that tested both his dignity and his practical judgment. By early 1936, as King George V's health deteriorated and the succession approached, the relationship between Wallis and the Prince of Wales had reached a point where compromise or retreat seemed impossible. The prince's determination to marry Wallis had crystallized into an obsession that would accept no obstacles, while Wallis found herself swept along by forces she could no longer control. The transformation of the Prince of Wales into King Edward VIII on January 20th, 1936, changed everything about their relationship while solving none of its fundamental problems. The new king's elevated position only intensified the scrutiny surrounding Wallis, while making their eventual marriage seem both more necessary and more impossible. Wallis's decision to proceed with divorce proceedings against Ernest Simpson, announced in the summer of 1936, represented the final step toward a confrontation that would test the very foundations of the British constitutional system. Her decree nisi, granted in October 1936, set in motion a sequence of events that would culminate in the greatest crisis the modern monarchy had ever faced. The American press, unrestricted by the agreements that kept the British media silent, began extensive coverage of the romance that painted it as the greatest love story of the age. These reports, while romantic in tone, created international pressure that made private resolution of the crisis increasingly unlikely. As autumn deepened into winter, in 1936, Wallis found herself at the center of a storm that threatened to destroy not only her own life, but the institutional foundations of the British Empire. The choice between love and duty, which had seemed like an abstract philosophical question during the early stages of their relationship, now demanded immediate resolution with consequences that would affect millions of people across the globe. The woman who had begun as simply another guest at Lady Furness's country house party now faced the possibility of becoming either Queen of the British Empire or the cause of its greatest constitutional crisis. The gentle conversations beside fireplaces in English country houses had led to a moment when the fate of nations hung in the balance, waiting for decisions that would determine whether love or duty would ultimately triumph. As 1936 drew toward its close, with autumn leaves falling across the gardens of English country houses and winter fires beginning to warm London drawing rooms, Wallis Simpson found herself poised at the center of a historical moment that she had never sought but could no longer avoid. The American woman who had arrived in London 8 years earlier as the wife of a struggling businessman had become, through a combination of personal charm, circumstance, and genuine love, the most important figure in determining the future of the British monarchy. Her journey from Baltimore debutante to royal companion had been marked by challenges that tested her resilience, intelligence, and courage at every turn. The choices that lay ahead for Wallis, for the king who loved her, and for the empire that watched their every move would determine not only their personal happiness, but the nature of monarchy itself in the modern world. The quiet conversations and growing intimacy that had characterized their relationship during its early stages had evolved into a public drama that captured the imagination of people around the globe. As snow began to dust the windows of Fort Belvedere, where the king spent his evenings dreaming of a future with the woman he loved, and as similar snow fell outside Wallis's London flat, where she wrestled with the magnitude of the decision before her, the stage was set for choices that would resonate through history. The warmth of their love, genuine and deep despite all the complications that surrounded it, would soon be tested against the cold demands of constitutional duty and public expectation. Whether that love would prove strong enough to overcome centuries of tradition and protocol remained to be seen, but its power had already transformed both their lives beyond any possibility of return to their former simplicity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions that could no longer be postponed. The crisis that had been building throughout 1936 was approaching its climax, when words of love spoken in private would be weighed against vows of duty sworn before nations. Rest peacefully. Dear listener, knowing that love, whatever its ultimate fate, had already worked its quiet magic in the hearts of two people who found in each other something worth any sacrifice. Join us next time as we witness the moment when a king must choose between his crown and his heart, when the most powerful empire in the world holds its breath, waiting for a decision that will change everything. The winter of 1936 began with an ominous stillness that seemed to settle over Sandringham House like a gentle shroud. King George V, who had ruled the British Empire for more than a quarter century, lay in his bedroom overlooking the Norfolk countryside he had loved since childhood, his strength ebbing as slowly and inevitably as the tide retreating from the nearby shores of the Wash. The house itself, modest by royal standards, had always been the king's preferred retreat from the formal grandeur of Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. Its comfortable rooms, filled with family photographs and the accumulated treasures of a lifetime, provided a peaceful setting for the monarch's final days. The ticking of numerous clocks, a sound that had provided the gentle rhythm of family life for decades, now seemed to mark the passing of an era. With each soft chime, Prince Edward, summoned from London as his father's condition worsened, spent long hours in the sick room where duty and filial affection combined to keep him at his father's bedside. The conversations between the dying king and his eldest son, conducted in whispers that barely disturbed the room's profound quiet, touched on matters both personal and constitutional that would soon weigh heavily on the prince's shoulders. The king's final words to his heir, spoken with the last of his fading strength, carried both blessing and warning. Take care of yourself, my boy. The throne is a heavy burden. These prophetic words, delivered in a voice weakened by illness but strengthened by paternal love, would echo in Edward's mind throughout the tumultuous months that lay ahead. On the evening of January 20th, 1936, as snow fell gently across the Sandringham estate and the house settled into its customary evening quiet, King George V drew his last breath, surrounded by his family. The royal physician, following protocols established centuries earlier, stepped forward to feel for a pulse that no longer beat, then turned to face the new king with the words that had marked British royal transitions since medieval times. "The king is dead. Long live the king." Edward's accession to the throne occurred with the quiet efficiency that characterized all constitutional procedures in Britain. The formal proclamation, read from the steps of St. James's Palace on the grey morning of January 21st, 1936, announced to the Empire that Edward, Albert, Christian, George, Andrew, Patrick, David was now, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, Ireland, and the British dominions beyond the seas, Emperor of India, defender of the faith. The new king, watching the ceremony from a window of the palace with Wallis Simpson beside him, broke with tradition in a way that symbolized the changes he hoped to bring to the monarchy. Previous kings had observed their proclamation from within the palace, surrounded by courtiers and officials, but Edward's decision to include Wallis in this historic moment sent a clear signal about the direction his reign would take. The crowds, gathered in the courtyard below, unaware of the woman standing beside their new king, cheered with genuine enthusiasm for the monarch they hoped would bring fresh energy to an institution that had sometimes seemed remote from their daily concerns. Edward's popularity, built during his years as Prince of Wales, through his informal manner and obvious concern for ordinary people, created expectations that would prove both inspiring and burdensome. Inside the palace, the transition proceeded, according to rituals that had governed British royal succession for centuries. The Privy Council, assembled in the throne room with its red damask walls and gilded chairs, received the new king's oath to govern according to law and to maintain the Church of England's established position. Edward's voice, clear and steady as he recited these ancient promises, gave no hint of the personal struggles that would soon test his commitment to every word. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Gordon Lang, administered the oath with particular solemnity, perhaps sensing that this king might prove less predictable than his predecessors. The Church's role as guardian of public morality would bring it into direct conflict with Edward's personal desires in ways that neither man could fully anticipate as they performed these time-honored ceremonies. The first months of Edward VIII's reign unfolded with a promise that seemed to justify the high expectations surrounding his accession. The new king brought to his duties an energy and informality that contrasted sharply with his father's more traditional approach, creating excitement among those who hoped for a modernized monarchy more in tune with contemporary British society. Edward's first official engagements revealed both his strengths and his potential weaknesses as a constitutional monarch. His visit to the depressed mining regions of South Wales in November 1936, where unemployment had reached devastating levels, demonstrated his genuine concern for his subjects' welfare. His famous comment that something must be done about the miners' plight resonated with public sympathy while creating unease among government officials who preferred their monarchs to avoid specific policy statements. That the king's approach to state papers and official correspondence revealed work habits that alarmed his private secretaries and government ministers. Documents that required careful study were often left unread, while matters requiring prompt royal attention were delayed by Edward's social commitments and personal preoccupations. The red dispatch boxes that arrived daily at whatever residence the king was occupying often remained unopened for days while he pursued other interests. Fort Belvedere, Edward's beloved retreat in Windsor Great Park, became the informal headquarters of a court that operated according to new and sometimes chaotic principles. The castle, originally built as a Georgian folly and transformed by Edward into a comfortable country house, provided a relaxed atmosphere that encouraged the kind of honest conversation the king preferred to formal court procedures. Weekend parties at Fort Belvedere, attended by a mixture of aristocrats, Americans, and social climbing intellectuals, created an atmosphere that scandalized traditional courtiers, while delighting those who saw them as evidence of the monarchy's modernization. The informal dress, casual conversation, and late-night socializing that characterized these gatherings represented everything that Edward hoped to bring to royal life. Yet beneath this surface, modernity lay growing concerns about the king's judgment and priorities. His obvious infatuation with Wallis Simpson, which became more apparent with each public appearance, raised questions about his ability to separate personal desires from constitutional obligations. As summer turned to autumn in 1936, the relationship between King Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson had evolved beyond the point where discretion could prevent a constitutional confrontation. Wallis's divorce proceedings, begun in earnest during the summer months, created a timeline that would force decisions about the monarchy's future before the year's end. The Ipswich Assizes, where Wallis's divorce petition was heard on October 27, 1936, attracted minimal public attention in Britain due to press agreements that maintained silence on royal matters. However, foreign newspapers, particularly in America, had begun extensive coverage of what they portrayed as the greatest romance of the age. These reports, while sympathetic to the couple's situation, created international pressure that made private resolution of the crisis increasingly unlikely. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, a careful politician who preferred to avoid dramatic confrontations, found himself forced to address a situation that threatened the stability of both the monarchy and his government. Baldwin's meetings with the king during this period were conducted with the polite formality that characterized all official business, but their content revealed the growing distance between royal desire and constitutional possibility. The government's concerns about Wallis Simpson extended beyond her marital status to include questions about her background, her associates, and her potential influence over foreign policy. Intelligence reports, compiled with the thoroughness that marked British security services, painted a picture of a woman whose past included relationships and experiences that might prove embarrassing or dangerous if she became queen. Archbishop Cosmo Gordon Lang, as head of the Church of England, represented perhaps the most implacable opposition to the king's marriage plans. The Church's position on divorce, firmly established through centuries of theological development, made remarriage impossible for anyone whose former spouse remained alive. This religious prohibition carried constitutional weight because the monarch's role as supreme governor of the Church of England required personal adherence to its teachings. The constitutional experts who advised the government during this period faced precedents that offered little guidance for the situation. They confronted no British monarch had ever voluntarily abdicated, and the legal mechanisms for such an unprecedented event remained unclear until they were needed. Throughout the autumn of 1936, as the constitutional crisis deepened beneath the surface of public life, both Edward and Wallis experienced the intense pressure of carrying secrets that affected millions of people. Their private conversations, conducted in the comfortable rooms of Fort Belvedere or during long walks through Windsor Great Park, revealed the emotional toll of their impossible situation. Edward's determination to marry Wallis had crystallized into an obsession that accepted no compromise and recognized no obstacle as insurmountable. His late-night telephone calls to government ministers, his emotional appeals to family members, and his increasingly desperate attempts to find constitutional solutions, all reflected a man whose passionate nature had finally encountered a challenge that could not be overcome through charm or royal prerogative. Wallis, for her part, found herself swept along by forces she had never anticipated and could no longer control. Her letters during this period, written to friends and family with increasing urgency, revealed a woman who understood the magnitude of the choice facing the man she loved, but felt powerless to influence the outcome in any meaningful way. The king's daily routine during these crucial months combined his official duties with an emotional intensity that exhausted everyone around him. State functions were performed with mechanical precision, while his thoughts remained focused on the personal crisis that overshadowed every public appearance. His staff, accustomed to managing the complexities of royal protocol, found themselves dealing with situations for which no precedent existed. Ernest Simpson, caught between his wife's obvious commitment to another man and his own need to maintain dignity in an impossible situation, handled his role with a grace that surprised even his critics. His cooperation with Wallis's divorce proceedings reflected both practical acceptance of changed circumstances and genuine affection for a woman whose happiness had become more important to him than his own wounded pride. The silence maintained by the British press during this period created a curious disconnect between public perception and private reality. While newspapers around the world speculated about the king's romantic involvement, British subjects remained largely unaware of the crisis building at the heart of their government. The meeting between King Edward VIII and Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin on November 16, 1936, marked the point where private crisis became public confrontation. The encounter, held in the comfortable study at Buckingham Palace where so many crucial decisions in British history had been made, would determine not only the king's personal future, but the nature of constitutional monarchy itself. Baldwin arrived at the palace with the careful preparation that characterized his approach to all political challenges. His briefing papers, prepared by the finest legal minds in government, outlined the constitutional, religious, and political objections to the king's proposed marriage in language that left no room for misunderstanding or compromise. The king, for his part, entered the meeting with hopes that somehow his position and personal appeal might overcome the obstacles that others saw as insurmountable. His opening statement to the Prime Minister was direct and unambiguous. "I want to marry Mrs. Simpson, and I am prepared to go." Baldwin's response reflected both his personal sympathy for the king's situation and his unwavering commitment to constitutional principles. "Sir, this is a very grave matter indeed. If you marry Mrs. Simpson, the government will have no choice but to resign." The conversation that followed explored every possible avenue for compromise, from morganatic marriage to delayed announcement of engagement. But each proposal founded on the same fundamental objection: the British people and their dominion. Partners would not accept a twice-divorced American as their queen. The king's increasing agitation, as these alternatives were eliminated one by one, revealed the depth of his emotional commitment to Wallis and his growing realization that constitutional monarchy might not permit the personal happiness he sought. His repeated assertion that he could not rule effectively without the woman he loved struck Baldwin as evidence of emotional instability rather than romantic devotion. The meeting concluded without resolution, but both men understood that they had crossed a threshold from which retreat would be difficult, if not impossible. The constitutional machinery that would govern the crisis had been set in motion, and events would now unfold according to their own logic rather than the personal preferences of either participant. As November progressed toward December, the constitutional crisis that had begun as a private matter between the king and his government expanded to encompass the entire British Empire. The Dominion governments, represented by high commissioners in London and linked by telegraph to capitals around the world, faced their first major test of the constitutional arrangements established by the Statute of Westminster in 1931. The responses from Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and the Irish Free State revealed the complex political considerations that complicated any resolution of the crisis. Each Dominion government had to balance loyalty to the crown against the expectations of their own populations, many of whom held strong opinions about marriage, divorce, and royal behavior. Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, speaking for a Dominion where both British and French traditions influenced public morality, expressed polite but firm opposition to the King's marriage plans. His private correspondence during this period revealed the delicate political calculations required to maintain Canadian unity while participating in imperial decision-making. The Australian government, led by Joseph Lyons, represented perhaps the strongest opposition to the proposed marriage among the Dominion leaders. Australian society in 1936 retained strong religious influences that made acceptance of a divorced queen particularly difficult. While the country's geographic isolation from Britain made symbolic unity with the crown especially important, South African Prime Minister J.B.M. Hertzog faced unique challenges in a country where racial divisions created constant political tension. His government's response to the marriage crisis had to consider not only moral objections, but the potential impact on Afrikaner nationalism and the delicate balance between British and Dutch influences in South African politics. The Irish Free State, still working out its relationship with both Britain and the broader empire, saw the crisis as an opportunity to further define its independence while maintaining beneficial connections to the Commonwealth. Eamon de Valera's response combined constitutional correctness with subtle assertions of Irish autonomy. These Dominion responses, transmitted through official channels but discussed informally in clubs and drawing rooms throughout London, created pressure that made compromise increasingly unlikely and abdication increasingly inevitable. The carefully maintained silence of the British press finally ended on December 2, 1936, when Dr. Alfred Blunt, Bishop of Bradford, made public comments about the King's need for divine grace that everyone understood as references to the constitutional crisis. The bishop's words, delivered during a diocesan conference and reported in local newspapers, provided the excuse that Fleet Street had been seeking to break their informal embargo on royal coverage. The flood of newspaper coverage that followed transformed the crisis from a matter known only to government insiders and high society into a public drama that engaged the attention of every British subject. Headlines that had been impossible to print for months suddenly appeared on newsstands throughout the empire, creating public awareness and debate that made private resolution impossible. The competing narratives that emerged in different newspapers reflected the complex political and social divisions that the crisis had revealed. Conservative publications emphasized constitutional tradition and religious morality, while more liberal papers focused on personal freedom and modernization of outdated social attitudes. The King's supporters, led by Winston Churchill and Lord Beaverbrook, used their influence with friendly newspapers to present Edward's situation in the most sympathetic possible terms. Their arguments focused on the King's right to personal happiness and the need for the monarchy to adapt to changing social conditions in the modern world. Opposition newspapers, reflecting the views of government and church leaders, emphasized the dangers of abandoning traditional moral standards and the impossibility of accepting a twice-divorced American as Queen of the British Empire. Their coverage portrayed the crisis as a test of whether Britain would maintain its values or surrender them to inappropriate foreign influence. The public reaction to this sudden flood of information revealed a nation divided along lines that reflected broader social and political tensions. Working-class areas showed more sympathy for the King's personal situation, while middle-class districts expressed stronger support for traditional values and constitutional propriety. As public awareness of the crisis grew during the first days of December, King Edward VIII made a final attempt to appeal directly to his subjects for support. His proposal to address the nation by radio, laying out his case for marriage to Wallis Simpson while remaining on the throne, represented an unprecedented constitutional innovation that alarmed government officials and excited popular attention. Proposed broadcast, drafted with the assistance of Winston Churchill and other sympathetic advisors, would have broken entirely new ground in the relationship between monarchy and democracy. Never before had a British sovereign attempted to rally public opinion against the advice of elected government, and the implications of such an appeal extended far beyond the immediate crisis. The text of the proposed speech, circulated among government officials before being rejected by Baldwin's cabinet, revealed Edward's fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional monarchy's limitations. His appeal to ancient custom and royal prerogative ignored the reality that modern kings ruled only with the consent of Parliament and people, not in opposition to them. Baldwin's refusal to permit the broadcast reflected not only specific objections to the king's marriage plans, but broader concerns about the constitutional precedent such an appeal would establish. The principle that monarchs must accept ministerial advice, established through centuries of political development, could not be abandoned without undermining the entire system of parliamentary democracy. The king's reaction to this refusal marked the final stage of his transition from hope to desperation. His emotional appeals to family members, his frantic telephone calls to political supporters, and his increasingly erratic behavior all reflected a man who had finally encountered a situation that royal privilege could not overcome. The draft broadcast itself, preserved in government archives, revealed both Edward's genuine love for Wallis Simpson and his inability to understand why that love could not overcome constitutional obstacles. His references to the woman I love, and his promises to serve more effectively with her support, struck government officials as evidence of emotional instability rather than romantic devotion. By December 10, 1936, all alternatives had been exhausted, and King Edward VIII faced the stark choice between his crown and his heart. The constitutional machinery that would govern his abdication had been prepared with the efficiency that characterized British government at its best, while the personal agony of his decision remained hidden behind the formal protocols that governed royal behavior. The instrument of abdication, prepared by the finest legal minds in the kingdom, represented a document unprecedented in British constitutional history. Its formal language, carefully crafted to ensure legal precision while maintaining royal dignity, would transfer power from one brother to another with an efficiency that masked the human drama underlying the constitutional procedures. Edward's final day as king unfolded with a mixture of personal emotion and official ceremony that reflected the complex nature of his situation. Meetings with government officials alternated with private conversations with family members, while state business continued to flow through the machinery of government despite the uncertainty about who would ultimately sign the documents requiring royal approval. The signing ceremony itself, held in the comfortable study at Fort Belvedere, where Edward had spent his happiest hours as king, brought together his three brothers as witnesses to a moment that none of them had ever expected to witness. The scratching of the pen on parchment, the quiet murmur of official voices, and the gentle ticking of clocks created a soundtrack for the end of a reign that had lasted less than 11 months. Prince Albert, who would become King George VI within hours, watched his brother sign away the crown with emotions that combined sympathy for Edward's personal situation with horror at the burden now falling on his own unprepared shoulders. The brothers' embrace after the signing ceremony carried years of affection and understanding that transcended the constitutional crisis that had brought them to this moment. The Duke of Gloucester and the Duke of Kent, adding their signatures as witnesses, participated in a ceremony that would be remembered as long as the British monarchy survived. Their quiet efficiency in performing this painful duty reflected the royal family's commitment to constitutional obligation even in the most difficult personal circumstances. The evening of December 11th, 1936, brought the conclusion of the abdication crisis in the form of King Edward VIII's final broadcast to the empire he was leaving. The radio address, delivered from Windsor Castle after his abdication had been formally accepted by Parliament, reached an estimated audience of hundreds of millions of people around the world, who had followed the crisis with unprecedented interest. The BBC's arrangements for the broadcast reflected the historic nature of the occasion while maintaining the dignity appropriate to such a solemn moment. The castle's Augusta Tower, chosen for its symbolic significance and technical convenience, provided a setting that linked the departing king to centuries of royal tradition, even as he broke with that tradition in the most dramatic way possible. Edward's voice, familiar to radio audiences throughout the empire from years of ceremonial broadcasts, carried new emotional depth as he explained his decision to abandon the throne for the woman I love. The speech, polished by Winston Churchill's editorial skill but expressing Edward's own authentic feelings, achieved a dignity that surprised even his critics. The most memorable phrases of the address: "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love," would be remembered and quoted as long as the British monarchy endured. Their simple eloquence captured the human drama underlying constitutional procedures while maintaining the formal courtesy required by royal protocol. Listeners throughout the empire heard not just a king's abdication, but a man's explanation of choices that placed personal happiness above inherited obligation. The broadcast's impact extended far beyond its immediate political consequences to influence popular understanding of marriage, duty, and individual freedom for generations to come. The silence that followed the broadcast's conclusion seemed to settle over the entire empire like a gentle blanket, as millions of people absorbed the reality that their king had chosen love over duty in the most public way possible. Radio sets fell silent in homes from London to Sydney to Toronto as families contemplated the implications of what they had just witnessed. The constitutional machinery that transferred power from Edward VIII to George VI operated with the quiet efficiency that characterized British government at its best. The new king's accession, while overshadowed by the dramatic circumstances of his brother's abdication, proceeded according to ancient protocols that had governed royal succession. For centuries, George VI's first acts as monarch reflected both his personal character and the challenging circumstances of his accession. His immediate priority was to restore stability and dignity to a monarchy that had been shaken by months of constitutional crisis, while his private thoughts focused on the enormous responsibility that had fallen on shoulders never intended to bear such weight. The Privy Council meeting that formally recognized the new king brought together political leaders who had spent months managing an unprecedented crisis with constitutional experts who would now help establish new precedents for future guidance. Their collective relief at reaching resolution was tempered by awareness that the monarchy's relationship with public opinion had been fundamentally altered by recent events. Queen Elizabeth, the former Duchess of York, faced the transition from relative obscurity to royal prominence with the grace that would characterize her entire queenship. Her support for her husband during the abdication crisis had revealed strength of character that would prove essential during the challenging years ahead. The two young princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, experienced the transformation of their family circumstances with the resilience of childhood, though Princess Elizabeth's sudden change from presumptive spare to heir apparent would shape every aspect of her future development. That the departing Duke of Windsor, as Edward was now titled, prepared for exile with a mixture of relief at resolving the crisis and apprehension about the uncertain future that awaited him and Wallis. His final departure from British soil represented not just personal loss, but the end of possibilities that had once seemed unlimited. As December 1936 drew to its close, Britain and the Empire began to assess the costs and consequences of the abdication crisis that had dominated the final months of the year. The constitutional precedents established during these dramatic weeks would influence the monarchy's development for generations to come, while the personal stories of those involved continued to unfold according to their own complex logic. The new King George VI faced challenges that extended far beyond the immediate need to restore royal dignity and public confidence. His serious speech impediment, his lack of preparation for kingship, and his family's desire for private life all created obstacles that would require enormous personal courage to overcome. Queen Elizabeth's transformation from Duchess to Queen Consort required adjustments that touched every aspect of her family's existence. Her natural warmth and common sense, combined with unwavering support for her husband, would prove essential in rebuilding public affection for the monarchy during the difficult years ahead. The two princesses faced futures that had been completely altered by their uncle's abdication. Princess Elizabeth, now heir presumptive, would carry the weight of eventual queenship from her 11th birthday forward, while Princess Margaret would live her entire life in the shadow of constitutional obligations she could never fully escape. 4. Wallis Simpson, waiting in France for the legal procedures that would allow her marriage to the Duke of Windsor. The abdication represented both triumph and tragedy. She had won the love of a king, but at a cost that would make her one of the most controversial figures of her generation. The Duke of Windsor himself began the exile that would last for the rest of his life, with emotions that combined relief at escaping constitutional obligations with regret for opportunities lost and bridges burned. His choice had been made, but its consequences would unfold over decades in ways that neither he nor anyone else could fully anticipate. As winter deepened across Britain in the final days of 1936, the nation that had begun the year with such hopes for their new king found itself adjusting to realities that no one could have foreseen. The abdication crisis had tested constitutional arrangements, challenged social assumptions, and revealed the complex relationship between personal desire and public duty that would influence British society for generations to come. The love story that had begun with casual conversation at a country house party had culminated in the most dramatic constitutional crisis in modern British history. The quiet intimacy of private relationships had collided with the public demands of monarchy in ways that created precedents and memories that would never be forgotten. In drawing rooms across the empire, families gathered around wireless sets that had carried them through months of unprecedented drama discussed the implications of what they had witnessed. The gentle crackle of radio static and the soft murmur of domestic conversation provided a peaceful soundtrack for contemplation of events that had changed their world forever. The frost that covered the windows of Fort Belvedere, where the Duke of Windsor spent his last night on British soil, caught the moonlight like tears frozen in time. Inside, the comfortable rooms that had witnessed so much happiness and sorrow settled into silence that spoke of endings and beginnings, of choices made and prices paid, of love triumphant and duty abandoned. Across the Channel in France, Wallis Simpson waited for the reunion that would complete the most expensive love story in royal history. Her thoughts, as she prepared for a future that would be shaped by decisions made in those dramatic December days, reflected the complex emotions of a woman who had gained everything she thought she wanted and was only beginning to understand what it had cost. The new King George VI, settling into responsibilities he had never sought, began the reign that would carry Britain through its darkest hour and into a new era of constitutional monarchy. His quiet courage in accepting a burden thrust upon him by his brother's choices would ultimately prove that duty freely embraced could be as noble as love freely chosen. Rest peacefully, dear listener, knowing that love had tested the strongest institutions and oldest traditions, changing everything it touched while revealing truths about human nature that transcend constitutional arrangements and royal protocols. Join us next time for our final chapter as we follow the Duke and Duchess of Windsor into exile and discover how their great love story continued far from the throne he had abandoned for her sake. The Duke of Windsor's departure from Portsmouth aboard HMS Fury on the grey morning of December 12, 1936, marked the beginning of an exile that would last for the remainder of his life. As the naval vessel slipped its moorings and turned toward the open sea, the man who had been King of England just hours before stood at the stern, watching his homeland disappear into the winter mist. The crossing to Calais passed in contemplative silence, with the Duke wrapped in naval greatcoat against the Channel's bitter wind. His thoughts divided between the woman waiting for him in France and the throne he had abandoned forever. The rhythm of the ship's engines and the gentle roll of the grey waters provided a meditation on choices made and prices paid that would characterize much of his future reflection. His arrival at the Château de Candy, near Tours in the Loire Valley, brought the Duke to a sanctuary that would shelter him during the most difficult months of his life. The chateau, lent by the sympathetic French businessman Charles Badeau, offered not only physical comfort, but the emotional support of friends who understood that even former kings needed places where they could grieve for losses that the world might not recognize as real. The castle's comfortable rooms, with their mixture of French elegance and modern convenience, provided the Duke with his first taste of the private life he had chosen over public obligation. Here, away from the protocols and restrictions that had governed every moment of his royal existence, he could begin to discover what it meant to be simply a man in love, rather than a king in crisis. His daily routine during these months of waiting for Wallis's divorce to become final, for the wedding that would complete their union, for some sign of reconciliation with the family he had left behind, combined the leisurely pace of chateau life with the nervous energy of a man whose future remained fundamentally uncertain. The surrounding countryside, dormant under winter's gentle touch, offered peaceful walks where the Duke could process the magnitude of the changes that had transformed his life. The bare branches of ancient oaks, the frost-covered meadows stretching toward distant villages, and the quiet murmur of the Loire, flowing past the chateau's grounds, all contributed to a sense of timeless tranquility that helped heal wounds that protocol would never have allowed him to acknowledge. The spring of 1937 brought not only the renewal of the French countryside, but the legal completion of Wallis's divorce proceedings, making possible the wedding that had cost a king his crown. The preparations for the ceremony, conducted with a mixture of hope and sadness, reflected the complex emotions surrounding a union that had already changed the course of history. Wallis's arrival at the Château de Candy in early May completed a reunion that both lovers had dreamed of during their months of separation, their first moments together as free individuals, able to marry without constitutional complications, carried all the joy and relief that had been denied them during the long crisis that had led to abdication. The wedding date, set for June 3rd, 1937, would have been King George V's 72nd birthday, timing that some interpreted as deliberate provocation, but which probably reflected nothing more than practical scheduling considerations. The significance of the date was lost on neither the couple nor their critics, adding another layer of complexity to an event already freighted with historical importance. The chateau's chapel, decorated with flowers from the estate's gardens, and softly lit by candles that had illuminated countless ceremonies over the centuries, provided an intimate setting for vows that carried more emotional weight than any royal coronation. The ancient stones, which had witnessed the prayers and celebrations of generations of French nobility, now sheltered the conclusion of the greatest romance of the age. Wallis's wedding dress, designed by Mainbocher in a shade that would forever be known as Wallis blue, reflected both her personal style and the understated elegance that had always characterized her approach to fashion. The simple lines and perfect fit demonstrated that true sophistication needed no elaborate ornament to make its impact felt. The Duke's morning dress, worn with the quiet dignity that had marked his approach to ceremonial occasions throughout his life, transformed him from former king to devoted bridegroom in the space of a few hours. His obvious happiness as he waited for his bride to appear created an atmosphere of joy that overcame even the sadness of his family's absence. The wedding ceremony itself, conducted by the Reverend Robert Anderson Jardine in the chateau's intimate chapel, brought together the handful of friends and supporters who had stood by the couple through their greatest trials. The guest list, numbering fewer than 20 people, represented a profound contrast to the elaborate state occasions that would have surrounded a royal wedding under different circumstances. The absence of any member of the royal family cast a shadow over the proceedings that no amount of floral decoration could entirely dispel. The Duke's visible sadness at this rejection by his loved ones, combined with his obvious joy at finally marrying Wallis, to create an emotional complexity that moved even the most cynical observers to sympathy. Wallis's aunt Bessie Merriman, who had travelled from America to witness her niece's triumph, represented the only family member present for either bride or groom. Her presence provided a link to the Baltimore childhood that had shaped Wallis's character, and a reminder that even the most extraordinary love stories have their roots in ordinary family affection. Major Edward Fruity Metcalf, the Duke's former equerry and closest friend, served as best man with a loyalty that would be remembered and appreciated for the rest of the Duke's life. His presence represented the military traditions and masculine friendships that had sustained the Duke through his years of service and crisis. The vows themselves, spoken in voices that carried clearly through the chapel's soft acoustics, promised a devotion that would be tested by decades of exile, disappointment, and criticism, but would never waver in its fundamental commitment. The ancient words of the marriage service, repeated in countless ceremonies over centuries, took on new meaning when spoken by two people whose love had already cost them so much. The exchange of rings, simple bands that symbolized eternal commitment, completed a ceremony that had cost a kingdom but created a partnership that would endure until death. The soft light filtering through stained glass windows painted rainbow patterns on stone floors that had been worn smooth by generations of worshippers, blessing this newest union with colors that seemed to promise hope despite all difficulties. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor's honeymoon, spent traveling through Austria and Italy during the summer of 1937, provided their first experience of life as private individuals, free to travel and live according to their own preferences rather than state requirements. The journey, conducted with the relative simplicity that characterized their new existence, revealed both the pleasures and the challenges of their changed circumstances. Their stay at Wasselienberg Castle in Austria, guests of friends who understood their need for privacy and peace, offered mountain air and alpine scenery that provided perfect counterpoint to the emotional intensity of recent months. The castle's comfortable rooms, with views across valleys filled with wildflowers and the distant sound of cowbells echoing from high meadows, created an atmosphere of timeless tranquility. The Duke's obvious contentment during these weeks reflected not just the satisfaction of finally being married to the woman He loved but relief at escaping the constant pressure and criticism that had characterized his final months as king. Here, among friends who valued him for himself rather than his former position, he could begin to discover what happiness might look like without a crown. Wallis's adjustment to her new title and position proved more complex than either she or her husband had anticipated. The Duchess of Windsor held a unique place in the social hierarchy, neither fully royal nor entirely private, that required constant navigation of protocol questions that had no established precedents. The denial of the style Her Royal Highness created complications that went far beyond mere social formality. In a world where such distinctions carried real meaning for diplomatic recognition and social acceptance, Wallis found herself excluded from many of the occasions and institutions that would have welcomed the wife of any other duke. Their eventual arrival in Italy, where Mussolini's government treated them with the elaborate courtesy due to distinguished visitors, provided their first taste of the kind of official recognition that would characterize much of their future travel. The warm Italian welcome, while politically motivated, offered some compensation for the cool reception they had received from many quarters in their own countries. The Duke and Duchess's visit to Nazi Germany in October 1937, undertaken at the invitation of the German Labour Front, would prove to be one of the most controversial decisions of their entire exile. The 12-day tour, intended to study social welfare programs and industrial development, instead created lasting questions about the Duke's political judgment and personal sympathies. The invitation itself, extended through intermediaries who emphasized the educational nature of the proposed visit, appealed to the Duke's genuine interest in social reform and his hope that personal diplomacy might help preserve European peace. His decision to accept reflected both naivety about Nazi motivations and frustration with his exclusion from any meaningful role in British public life. Their arrival in Berlin, met by senior Nazi officials and covered extensively by German propaganda services, provided Adolf Hitler's regime with exactly the kind of legitimacy they sought from association with former British royalty. The Duke's obvious pleasure at the warm reception accorded him contrasted sharply with the cool treatment he had received from his own government and family. The carefully orchestrated tours that followed included visits to housing projects, youth camps, and industrial facilities that showcased Nazi achievements while concealing the regime's more sinister aspects. The Duke's genuine interest in social welfare programs and his host's skill at presentation combined to create impressions that would later prove deeply embarrassing. The meeting between the Duke and Adolf Hitler at the Berghof, the mountain retreat in Bavaria, represented the symbolic climax of a visit that had already generated international controversy. The photographs of the Duke and Duchess chatting cordially with Nazi leaders, published around the world, created images that would haunt their reputation for the rest of their lives. The Duke's Nazi salute, captured by photographers and distributed globally, provided ammunition for critics who had always questioned his judgment and patriotism. His later explanations that he was simply following diplomatic protocol convinced few observers and added to the growing perception that his abdication had saved Britain from a potentially disastrous reign. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 found the Duke and Duchess of Windsor living quietly in Paris, their lives focused on the social activities and domestic pleasures that had replaced the grand purposes they had once hoped to serve. The war's beginning forced them to confront questions about duty, loyalty, and service that their exile had seemed to resolve. The Duke's immediate offer of service to his country, conveyed through proper diplomatic channels, reflected both genuine patriotism and hope that national crisis might provide opportunities for reconciliation with the family and government he had left behind. His military experience and knowledge of European conditions could have proved valuable assets in the struggle against Nazi Germany. The British government's response, offering the Duke a liaison position with the French military mission, represented a careful compromise between the need to avoid waste of potential talent and determination to prevent any restoration of his former influence. The post, while genuine in its responsibilities, kept him safely removed from any position where his political views might prove embarrassing or dangerous. The Duke's service in France during the Phoney War, period of 1939–1940, provided him with his first meaningful work since the Abdication, though the limitations placed on his role ensured that his contribution remained largely symbolic. His reports on French military preparations, while professionally competent, carried little influence with superiors who remained suspicious of his judgment. The Duchess's own war work, supporting relief organizations and maintaining the comfortable social atmosphere that helped sustain morale among British and American expatriates, reflected her understanding that even former royalty had obligations during national crisis. Her entertaining of military personnel and diplomatic officials provided valuable service, while maintaining the social prominence that had always been important to her sense of identity. The German breakthrough in May 1940 that led to France's collapse forced the Duke and Duchess to confront dangers they had never anticipated during their comfortable exile. Their flight south to escape the advancing German armies provided their first real taste of the fear and uncertainty that war brought to ordinary people throughout Europe. The Duke and Duchess's journey through Spain and Portugal during the summer of 1940, while ostensibly simple transit to safety, became entangled in intelligence operations and political intrigue that revealed the complex loyalties created by their unique position. Their movements were monitored by multiple governments, while their own understanding of the forces swirling around them remained dangerously incomplete. The German plot, known as Operation Willy, designed to kidnap the Duke and use him as a puppet ruler in a Nazi-dominated Britain, represented the logical conclusion of his 1937 German visit and his reputation for sympathy with authoritarian solutions to social problems. The scheme's existence, while never directly threatening due to its impractical nature, illustrated the continuing perception that the Duke might serve Nazi interests. Winston Churchill's decision to offer the Duke the governorship of the Bahamas reflected both genuine concern for his safety and determination to remove him from any position where his political views might compromise the war effort. The appointment, while carrying real responsibilities, essentially constituted elegant exile to a colonial backwater. The Duke's acceptance of the Bahamas position, after considerable hesitation and negotiation about terms, reflected both recognition of his limited alternatives and hope that successful colonial administration might eventually lead to more significant opportunities for service. His understanding that refusal might be interpreted as disloyalty to the war effort made acceptance nearly inevitable. The Duchess's reaction to their new assignment combined disappointment at leaving the sophisticated society of Europe with determination to make the best of circumstances that offered little choice. Her private correspondence during this period revealed frustration with what she saw as punishment for political views that differed little from those held by many other members of their former social circle. Their departure for Nassau aboard a neutral American vessel in August 1940 marked another stage in an exile that had already carried them far from the world they had known as Prince and future Princess of Wales. The tropical posting that awaited them would test their marriage and their characters in ways that European society had never required. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor's arrival in Nassau in August 1940 brought them to a British colony that represented everything they had least expected. from their post-abdication life. The tropical setting, with its palm trees and coral beaches, provided a dramatic contrast to the European sophistication they had grown to expect as the natural environment for their exile. Government House, the governor's official residence, required extensive renovation before it could provide the comfort and dignity that the Duchess considered essential for their position. Her supervision of the restoration project, conducted with characteristic attention to detail and determination to achieve the highest standards, provided welcome distraction from the isolation of their new posting. The Duke's approach to his gubernatorial duties revealed both the strengths and limitations he would have brought to constitutional monarchy. His genuine concern for the welfare of ordinary Bahamians, combined with sometimes impractical ideas about social reform, created friction with local elites, while earning respect among working-class residents of the islands. The racial attitudes both the Duke and Duchess displayed during their Caribbean service reflected the assumptions of their generation and class, but seemed particularly anachronistic in a colony where white settlers comprised a small minority of the population. Their paternalistic approach to colonial administration, while well-intentioned, revealed the cultural blindness that characterized much European colonial thinking. The Duchess's work with the Red Cross and various charitable organizations provided her with meaningful activity, while demonstrating the organizational skills that had made her an effective hostess in more glamorous circumstances. Her fundraising abilities and talent for inspiring volunteer efforts proved valuable assets in a colony with limited resources for social services. Their social life in Nassau, necessarily restricted by the small size of the colonial elite and the limitations imposed by wartime conditions, required adjustments that tested their ability to find satisfaction in greatly reduced circumstances. The dinner parties and receptions that had once brought together the most interesting people in Europe were replaced by more modest gatherings that nonetheless maintained some semblance of their former elegance. The isolation of their Bahamas posting, while providing safety from European warfare, created emotional challenges that tested both the Duke's and Duchess's capacity for finding meaning in reduced circumstances. Their correspondence during this period revealed frustrations and disappointments that contrasted sharply with the tropical paradise that surrounded their daily life. The Duke's struggle with depression, exacerbated by separation from the family and country he had served for most of his life, manifested itself in periods of lethargy and withdrawal that concerned even the limited circle of friends available in colonial Nassau. His afternoon walks along Cable Beach, conducted in solitude that would have been impossible during his royal years, provided both exercise and opportunity for the kind of brooding reflection that rarely produces happiness. The Duchess's own battles with boredom and frustration, conducted with the social skills that prevented public acknowledgement of her dissatisfaction, revealed the personal costs of their spectacular romance. Her letters to friends in America and Europe, carefully worded to avoid giving offense, but clearly conveying her longing for more stimulating society, painted a picture of exile that was comfortable but spiritually unsatisfying. Their marriage, tested by the stresses of isolation and reduced circumstances, nevertheless demonstrated the deep affection that had motivated their original sacrifice. Their obvious pleasure in each other's company, noted by visitors and staff throughout their Caribbean years, provided evidence that their love had survived the transition from romantic ideal to domestic reality. The Duke's attempts to find meaningful work beyond his official duties led to various schemes and projects that reflected both his genuine desire to serve useful purposes and his sometimes impractical approach to complex problems. His plans for agricultural development, educational reform, and economic modernization revealed both insight and naivety about colonial realities. The Duchess's parallel efforts to create cultural and social improvements in Nassau society, conducted through ladies' auxiliary organizations and charitable committees, demonstrated her understanding that even limited circumstances offered opportunities for useful service. Her ability to inspire volunteer efforts and organize successful events proved valuable in a community where such talents were rare. The conclusion of World War II in 1945 found the Duke and Duchess of Windsor facing questions about their future that had been postponed but not resolved by their years of colonial service. The end of his governorship provided an opportunity to reassess their lives and consider what possibilities might exist for useful service in the post-war world. Their departure from Nassau in May 1945, conducted with ceremonies that acknowledged the Duke's conscientious performance of his duties while revealing widespread relief at the conclusion of an unusual chapter in colonial administration, marked another transition in their long exile. The warm farewells from many Bahamian friends provided evidence that their service had been appreciated. Despite its limitations, the question of where to establish their post-war residence required consideration of factors that ranged from practical matters of taxation and legal status to emotional needs for social acceptance and intellectual stimulation. Their eventual decision to return to France reflected both practical considerations and hope that European society might prove more welcoming than their own countries had been. Their temporary residence in various American hotels and resorts during the immediate post-war period provided opportunities to renew friendships and assess possibilities for permanent settlement in the United States. The warm reception they received from American society, which had always been more sympathetic to their romance than British opinion had been, suggested possibilities for a more satisfying future. The Duke's tentative explorations of opportunities for business involvement or public service in America revealed both his continued desire for meaningful work and the limitations imposed by his unique status. Former kings, however popular, faced restrictions that made normal careers or public positions nearly impossible to achieve. The Duchess's parallel assessment of their social and personal needs led to her conclusion that European residence would provide the best compromise between comfort, dignity, and intellectual stimulation. Her judgment, informed by years of experience in managing their complex social position, would ultimately determine the direction of their future life together. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor's return to France in the early 1950s marked the beginning of what would prove to be their permanent exile from the countries of their birth. Their decision to establish residence in Paris reflected both practical considerations and hope that French society might provide the sophisticated atmosphere they had missed during their years of tropical isolation. Their rental of a mansion at 4 Rue du Champ-d'Entraînement, near the Bois de Boulogne, provided the kind of elegant setting that suited both their personal tastes and social requirements. The house, furnished with a mixture of family heirlooms saved from their earlier residences and carefully chosen antiques that reflected their accumulated understanding of beautiful objects, became a center for the kind of entertaining that had always provided structure for their lives. The Duchess's supervision of the house's decoration and management revealed the aesthetic sensibility that had made her dinner parties memorable throughout her adult life. Her attention to detail, from flower arrangements that changed with the seasons to menu planning that showcased both French culinary traditions and American innovations, created an atmosphere that attracted interesting guests from around the world. The Duke's daily routine in their new home combined the leisure activities appropriate to his position with various projects that provided intellectual stimulation without the pressures of official responsibility. His gardening efforts, conducted in the small plot behind their urban mansion, offered peaceful recreation while maintaining connection to the outdoor interests that had sustained him throughout his life. Their social circle in Paris included a mixture of expatriate Americans, cultivated Europeans, and the occasional visitor from Britain who maintained friendship despite official disapproval. The dinner parties and receptions they hosted became known for their combination of elegant hospitality and stimulating conversation that made their home a destination for sophisticated travelers. The financial arrangements that supported their Parisian lifestyle combined income from the Duke's various investments with the allowance provided by his brother, King George VI. The Duchess's careful management of their resources, informed by memories of earlier financial insecurity, ensured that they could maintain appropriate dignity, while avoiding the extravagance that might have attracted unwelcome attention. The 1960s brought changes to the Duke and Duchess of Windsor's lives that reflected both their advancing age and gradual shifts in public attitudes toward their long-ago romance. The Duke's deteriorating health, caused by a lifetime of smoking and the stresses of their unusual position, required increasing medical attention while limiting their social activities. Their occasional visits to London, undertaken for family funerals and other ceremonial occasions, provided bittersweet reunions with the royal family that had never fully forgiven the choices made in 1936. The Duke's obvious pleasure at these brief returns to his homeland contrasted sharply with the formal coldness that still characterized official attitudes toward his marriage. The Duchess's role as caregiver during the Duke's declining years revealed depths of devotion that silenced even their harshest critics. Her attention to his comfort and dignity, maintained despite her own advancing age, and the increasing isolation imposed by his illness, demonstrated the genuine affection that had motivated their original sacrifice. Their relationship with the younger generation of royals, particularly Prince Charles, suggested possibilities for eventual reconciliation that might transcend the bitter divisions created by the abdication crisis. The Prince of Wales's visits to their Paris home, conducted with his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II's knowledge, if not explicit approval, indicated gradual softening of official attitudes. The Duke's final years were marked by the kind of peaceful, domestic routine that he had chosen over royal responsibility 3 decades earlier. His satisfaction with that choice, evident to all who observed their relationship during this period, validated the decision that had cost him his throne but gained him the companionship that had proved more valuable than any crown. The memoirs and interviews they gave during their later years provided their own interpretation of events that had fascinated the world for decades. Their consistent message that love had proved stronger than duty, and that they had no regrets about choices that had brought them lasting happiness, offered a perspective that time had made both more credible and more poignant. The Duke of Windsor's death on May 28, 1972, brought to an end a life that had been shaped by perhaps the most famous romantic decision in modern history. His final weeks, spent in the comfortable bedroom of their Paris home, with the woman who had inspired his greatest sacrifice, caring for him with tireless devotion, provided a peaceful conclusion to their extraordinary love story. The return of his body to Britain for burial at Frogmore, near Windsor Castle, represented a final reconciliation that death had made possible where life had not. Queen Elizabeth II's decision to allow the Duchess to stay at Buckingham Palace during the funeral visit acknowledged both protocol requirements and personal sympathy for a widow's grief. The funeral service itself, conducted with dignity that honored both the Duke's royal birth and his personal choices, brought together family members and friends who had been divided by decades of controversy. The presence of the Duchess, frail but determined to pay final respects to the man whose love had transformed both their lives, provided visual testimony to a devotion that had outlasted crowns and kingdoms. The Duke's burial in the royal burial ground represented both ending and beginning, the conclusion of his remarkable life and the commencement of a widowhood that would test the Duchess's strength in ways that even their years of exile had not required. Her obvious grief, dignified but undeniable, moved even observers who had criticized their choices throughout the decades. The Duchess's return to Paris after the funeral began 14 years of widowhood that gradually reduced her world to the small circle of rooms where she had shared her greatest happiness. Her declining health, complicated by the onset of dementia that robbed her of the intellectual clarity that had been her greatest asset, created isolation that even the most devoted care could not entirely alleviate. Her conversations with nurses and companions during these final years often returned to memories of the Duke and the life they had shared together. Her obvious contentment when speaking of their marriage, despite all the costs and complications it had entailed, provided final testimony to the genuine happiness their love had created. The Duchess of Windsor's death, on April 24, 1986, at the age of 89, brought to its conclusion the love story that had captivated the world for more than half a century. Her final years, marked by the gradual withdrawal from engagement with the world that characterizes advanced age and illness, nevertheless retained moments of clarity that revealed the fundamental satisfaction she had found in the life she and the Duke had created together. Her funeral, held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, with full honours appropriate to her rank as a Duchess, an acknowledgement of her unique place in royal history, demonstrated the final reconciliation that time and changing attitudes had made possible. The presence of Queen Elizabeth II and other senior royals provided official recognition that had been denied during the most bitter years of the exile. The burial service, conducted beside the Duke's grave in the royal burial ground at Frogmore, completed a reunion that death had delayed but not denied. The simple headstone that marks their shared resting place bears witness to a love that had proved stronger than constitutional convention, social expectation, and family pressure. The gardens surrounding their graves, maintained with the careful attention that royal burials receive, provide a peaceful setting where visitors can contemplate the choices that transformed to lives and influenced the development of constitutional monarchy throughout the English-speaking world. The seasonal flowers that bloom and fade in endless cycles around their tombs offer natural testimony to the persistence of beauty despite the passage of time. Their legacy, debated by historians and biographers, but validated by the simple fact of their enduring happiness together, challenges conventional assumptions about the relationship between personal fulfillment and public duty. The question of whether the Duke made the right choice in 1936 continues to provoke discussion, but the evidence of their marriage suggests that love, freely chosen and faithfully maintained, creates its own form of success. The documents and photographs preserved in various archives around the world provide testimony to a relationship that retained its essential character from their first meeting at Lady Furness's country house party to their final separation by death. Their correspondence, their public appearances, and the observations of friends and critics all confirm that what began as romantic infatuation deepened into genuine partnership that sustained them through challenges that few marriages ever face. As we reach the end of our peaceful journey through love's greatest triumph over duty, the soft light of dawn begins to touch the windows of homes where our story has been shared across continents and generations. The tale of Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, which began with casual conversation at a country house party and culminated in the transformation of monarchy itself, offers lessons about the power of love to challenge even the most ancient institutions. Their story, told now as a bedtime tale to soothe away the troubles of contemporary life, reminds us that choices made in private drawing rooms can echo through history in ways that their makers never anticipate. The gentle conversations that first drew them together grew into a love that would test constitutional traditions, divide families, and ultimately demonstrate that the human heart recognizes obligations that transcend political convenience and social expectation. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor sleep now in their quiet corner of the royal burial ground. Their long exile concluded, and their controversial choices vindicated by the simple fact of having found happiness together, despite all obstacles. The love that cost him a throne and made her one of the most criticized women of her generation had proved strong enough to sustain them through decades of separation from family, country, and the life they had originally expected to live. The gardens that surround their final resting place, with their carefully tended roses and ancient trees that have witnessed centuries of royal history, provide appropriate setting for contemplating a love story that belongs now to the ages. The gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze, the soft chiming of chapel bells that mark the passage of time, and the peaceful silence that settles over royal burial grounds at night, all contribute to the sense of completion that comes with stories well told and lives well lived. Their legacy extends beyond the constitutional precedents established by the abdication crisis to touch something deeper in human understanding of what it means to choose love over security, passion over prudence, and personal happiness over inherited obligation. The questions their story raises about the relationship between individual freedom and social responsibility remain as relevant today as they were in 1936. As our final chapter draws to its close, we return to the essential truth that has sustained this story through all its complications and controversies, that two people found in each other something worth any sacrifice, and that their love created happiness that lasted until death separated them. The fairy tale ending that critics claimed was impossible proved to be the simple reality of their lived experience. The Duke, who gave up the most powerful throne in the world for the woman he loved, never expressed regret for that choice. His consistent testimony, from the Abdication broadcast in 1936 to his final interviews in the 1960s, affirmed that personal happiness had proved more valuable than any crown. The Duchess, who inspired that sacrifice and shared its consequences, found in their marriage the security and affection that had eluded her through earlier relationships. Their love, tested by exile, criticism, war, and advancing age, demonstrated qualities that romantic literature celebrates but realistic observation rarely confirms. The devotion they showed each other during their final years, when illness and isolation might have strained less genuine affection, provided evidence that what began as passion had deepened into the kind of partnership that justifies the risks they took to achieve it. The world that first condemned their choices gradually came to see their story as one of the great romances of the 20th century. The same newspapers that had criticized the abdication eventually celebrated their golden wedding anniversary as proof that true love could overcome any obstacle. Public opinion, which had once demanded his renunciation of the throne, ultimately admired the constancy that had sustained their marriage through all challenges. Their story reminds us that love, when it comes with the force that overwhelmed Edward and Wallis, recognizes no authority higher than itself. The constitutional traditions, religious prohibitions, and family expectations that seemed insurmountable in 1936 proved powerless against the simple determination of two people to spend their lives together, regardless of consequences. The gentle sleep that now encompasses both the Duke and Duchess of Windsor offers final testimony to the peace that comes from choosing love over duty when that choice reflects the heart's deepest convictions. There, rest, undisturbed by the controversies that once surrounded their names, speaks to the ultimate validation that time provides for decisions made with complete honesty about what matters most in human life. And so, dear listener, we reach the end of our journey through the greatest love story in royal history. A tale that began with conversation beside a fireplace and concluded with eternal rest beneath English soil. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor found in each other what philosophers call the highest form of love, affection freely given, faithfully maintained, and strong enough to overcome every obstacle that law, custom, and convention could place in its path. As you drift towards sleep, let your thoughts rest on the simple truth that love, when it comes with the power that transformed their lives, creates its own validation and needs no approval from courts or kingdoms. The happiness they discovered in each other's company provided all the justification they needed for choices that seemed impossible to others but inevitable to them. Their story, with all its complications and controversies, ultimately affirms the ancient wisdom that the heart has its own reasons that reason cannot fully understand. The love that cost Edward his throne and made Wallis the center of the greatest constitutional crisis in modern British history proved strong enough to sustain them through exile, criticism, and the inevitable challenges that time brings to every human relationship. Sleep peacefully now, knowing that somewhere in the quiet gardens of Frogmore, beneath ancient trees that have witnessed centuries of royal history, two people rest together who proved that love, freely chosen and faithfully maintained, can indeed conquer all. Their final union, undisturbed by earthly concerns and blessed by the understanding that time eventually brings to every human story, offers hope that the choices we make for love's sake will ultimately be vindicated by the happiness they create. Dream of moonlight on castle walls, of gentle conversations that changed the world, of vows spoken in small chapels that proved stronger than coronation oaths, and of a love that was worth every sacrifice made in its name. Rest well, sweet dreamer, surrounded by the knowledge that true love, however costly, always proves worth its price in the currency of human happiness. Good night, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with the certainty that love, when it comes with the force that moves mountains and topples thrones, will always find a way to triumph in the end. Until we meet again in dreams and stories, sleep peacefully, knowing that the greatest romances never truly end, but live forever in the hearts of those who understand what it means to choose love above all else. Sweet dreams, and thank you for sharing this gentle journey through love's greatest victory over duty.